It's wonderful to see you here bright and early. Thank you very much for turning up on time for day 2 of our Arctic Frontiers Conference. I'm Stephen Sacker. For those of you who were not here yesterday, I'm the moderator. I'm sort of running the show for the next couple of panels at least. And we've got 2 fabulous panels, interesting subjects, great topics coming up over the next couple of hours. There are a couple of things I want to say before I begin. One is a confession. I'm going to be very honest with all of you. Yesterday, Twitter was alive with discussion of my socks. And I was very flattered about this. And I do love a good, colourful sock. But I got into my hotel room last night and was looking for my outfit for today. And I realized I had forgotten to pack fresh socks. So today's socks are yesterday's socks. So Twitter, please be kind to me. As my kids would say to me, don't judge me. I'm wearing the same socks again. And I'm really sorry about that, but what can I do? Anyway, getting to more serious matters, we today wanted to do something a little bit different at Arctic Frontiers. We've got a topic which perhaps is going to be very challenging for some on our panel and challenging indeed for people like me in the media business. We're calling it Speaking Truth to Power, Science-Based Policy in a Post-Fact World. And as luck would have it, I've come here to Tromsø from the United States, where I've been doing some of my hard talk interviews with people in and around the Trump administration. And of course, if one's talking about the current trend in global politics, a trend which one has to say challenges accepted wisdoms and status quo thinking, then one has to begin in Washington, D.C. itself, because it's there that this notion of fake news was developed by the Trump administration to challenge the accepted wisdom that comes out of what he calls the mainstream media. It was indeed one of his key spokespeople, Kellyanne Conway, who developed this concept of alternative facts. And we have to consider, what does alternative facts really mean? Are there, in fact, facts? Is there hard evidence which has some sort of universal truth? And if there is such a thing, who presents it? Is it the scientists in many cases? Are we always to believe the scientists? Are scientists sometimes at war with each other with alternative facts? These are some of the very interesting issues which are particularly relevant to the Arctic, because the whole point of Arctic Frontiers is to bring together politicians, business people, and the scientific and research community all together in a dialogue. And one of the, I think, the assumptions is that the scientists come here with important information that the politicians, the business people need to know and to respond to and to develop strategy and policy around. But in this era, some of those assumptions are being challenged, and that's what we want to pick away at today. The degree to which emotion, in a sense, is now overriding hard evidence, data, and facts when it comes to policy making, and in particular policy making in this region. So that really is the framework for our first debate this morning. We've got keynote speakers who are going to speak for, and I should say this, keynotes, we want you to be disciplined about the 5-minute rule. We're going to hear the keynote remarks first, and then we're going to have a panel discussion where, of course, we do welcome your contributions, as ever, with our roving microphones. So without further ado, let me invite to the podium our first speaker. It's interesting because he is a man in government who's actually got a job which I believe he's only had for the best part of a week, so he's fairly new to his job, but it's an extremely important job, and not least for the subject matter of Arctic Frontiers. So do please give a very warm welcome to Ulla Elvestuen, who is Minister of Climate and Environment here in Norway. And Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Minister. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Facts hold a sacred place in our democracies. Facts are our defense against ignorance, manipulation, and post-truth policies. But the authority of facts is challenged by a combination of populist movements, vested interests, and social media. Almost all science-based information is now being challenged by alternative facts or outright misinformation. We live in what has been described as the rise of the post-fact world. Fake news was appointed Expression of the Year in 2017 by the Norwegian Language Council. It is indeed timely that Arctic Frontiers puts the fate of science-based policy on the agenda. The issue is a deep concern for the Arctic community, especially when it comes to climate science. Climate science is important as a basis for policy everywhere, not least in the Arctic, which is warming at least twice as fast as the global average. The UN panel of climate change is a prime example of how a common scientific knowledge base can create consensus for policies and action. The scientific assessments of climate change and pollution undertaken by the Arctic Council is another example. Consensus on scientific facts can narrow the field of political disagreement. Politicians might disagree on what is the best climate policy. Still, on the basis of scientific consensus, it is easier to act if we can agree on how much global temperature will rise. It is easier to act if you agree on what the likely consequences will be if we do not act. The power of a scientific consensus is well understood. Efforts to undermine it, therefore, is nothing new. In the 1960s, the tobacco industry started to manufacture doubt over science linking smoking to cancer. Anti-smoking policies were delayed for decades. In the 1990s, this strategy of doubt was blueprinted by the climate change deniers. In 2000, the US Republican advisor Frank Luntz wrote in a memo, and I quote, "Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate," unquote. No doubt Luntz and the other merchants of doubt have had some success. In peer-reviewed papers by climate scientists, there's a 97% consensus that global warming is caused by humans. If this overwhelming consensus is a surprise to you, it might be because it is even still today not fully reflected in the media. Climate change deniers still have a disproportionate access to the media, claiming that climate science is highly uncertain. Some media still also strive for a balance between climate science and the nonsense you can find in the blogosphere. This has weakened our sense of urgency. For 2 decades, policymakers have used this as an argument for not adopting stronger climate policies. So how can we turn this tide in an environment of post-truth politics, alternative facts, and systematic misinformation? The main messages are, for the scientists, be brave in your communication, don't understate the risks, make us understand that uncertainty is not an excuse for inaction, and not least, continue to do good and policy-relevant science in the Arctic and elsewhere. For business, don't let your vested interests compromise your acceptance of scientific facts. If the scientific consensus is a threat to your business model, change your model. And for the politicians, trust the scientific consensus and let it inform our policies. Don't cherry-pick results that support our values. Ensure the access to good data, analytic skills, and political support for the use of scientific information. There is also reason to be optimistic. Science and technology is progressing fast, and so is scientific cooperation, not least in the Arctic. An increasing number of countries and companies develop policies aligned with science and technological development. There are signs that science will defeat ignorance, just as researchers finally defeated the tobacco industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Minister Elvestuen. One of the great things about Arctic Frontiers is that we bring together people obviously from within the high north, from the region itself, but also many people who are interested in this region from far away, either because they care about it in the sense of the well-being of the planet, but also because they see opportunity here, business opportunity, and also they're fascinated to pursue the scientific studies here too. So that's just by way of prelude to asking you to welcome our next speaker. He's the Minister of State in the Prime Minister's Office and Minister of Manpower in Singapore. He's a very long-time friend and guest here at Arctic Frontiers. Please welcome Sam Tan, and indeed his Arctic shoes as well. So Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And very good morning to all of you. This is my 4th appearance at the Arctic Frontiers Conference. Yesterday, a mayor from Alaska said that when you come to the Arctic, you've got to listen to the Arctic people. That reminds me that a few years ago, when I first came to Tromsø to attend the Arctic Frontiers Conference, so my Tromsø friend told me that to keep your feet warm, you got to buy a pair of sealskin boots. I listened, and I got these boots. And then 1 year later, I went to Greenland to attend another Arctic conference. So my Greenland friend told me that to keep your hands warm, you have to get a pair of sealskin gloves. And I listened, and therefore I got this pair of sealskin gloves. And today, as someone who is from outside the Arctic coming here to talk about Arctic, I hope that in the same token, you can also listen to me for just 5 minutes. So ladies and gentlemen, the world is changing fast and unpredictably in weather patterns. And last year, heat waves swept across the globe, leading to prolonged droughts and increased wildfires in many countries. Even tropical countries like Singapore have experienced unusual climate change. 2017, last year, was recorded as one of the warmest years in Singapore. And then, interestingly, entering 2018, we are still in the first month of 2018, when Singapore has already experienced one of our coldest spells in recent memories. So as the thermometer for climate change, the Arctic experiences these changes in the extreme. Fortunately, science will help us to better understand these changes and prepare us to better protect the fragile and precious Arctic. Singapore's Arctic research policy aims to build out our own Arctic knowledge, develop solutions to Arctic challenges, and create awareness of the Arctic issues in our region, the Southeast Asia region. In doing so, Singapore hopes to make meaningful contributions within our means to the work of the Arctic Council. And to deepen our knowledge, our institutes like the National University of Singapore conduct research on various Arctic-related topics like remote energy systems and ice mechanics. Other initiatives, such as the Ocean Governance Research Program, will also help to improve our understandings of ocean governance and maritime law. In addition to our own Arctic research efforts, the NUS Center for International Law and the K.G. Jepson Center for the Law of the Sea at the University of Tromsø have collaborated to publish a book on the governance of Arctic shipping, which will be launched soon. However, research alone is not enough. Efforts must also be made to translate knowledge into sustainable solutions to the region's challenges, whether it is in the Arctic region or in the Southeast Asia regions. To this end, Singapore has established quite a few laboratories to explore these Arctic technologies. We are currently constructing a state-of-the-art deep water ocean basin lab that can simulate Arctic conditions, sea conditions, basin conditions. And this will allow us to test bed offshore and marine systems faster, more accurately, when the lab is completed in 2019 at a cost of more than $100 million Sing dollars. Research also cannot be conducted in isolation, and people must come together to share knowledge and exchange experiences at the various Arctic platforms like this one. So in this regard, Singapore shares data on the Arctic migratory bird populations, and also our experience of oil spill mitigation and management with the Arctic Council's CAF and EPPR working groups. Scientific findings should also be communicated to the public to increase awareness of the Arctic's importance. So in this respect, we work with the Finnish Embassy and High Commission of Canada in Singapore to co-organize the Ice in the Arctic Tropics seminar in November 2017. In September last year, we also cooperated with the Norwegian Embassy in Singapore and the NUS will organize the first Arctic Frontier Abroad Forum, the first kind in Asia. So through all these initiatives, Singapore hopes to continue educating the public and also providing platforms for healthy and constructive discourse on the Arctic in the Southeast Asia region. In conclusion, the Arctic Report Card published by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that 2017 as the second warmest year in the Arctic since 1900, with the lowest maximum ice. The finding is really indeed scary, alarming, and worrying. But so long as we are able to cope, to deal with all this global warming and Arctic melting as a challenge, so long as we are able to work together collectively on a science-based approach, then I think we will be able to come up with solutions and secure a sustainable future of the Arctic for generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister, and it's wonderful to get a perspective from far away from Southeast Asia, and we thank you for that, and we look forward to your contribution in the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you now to another minister, another man of government, this time from inside Europe, from Hungary. He's a man I know well. He's been on my Hard Talk program more than once because he has strong and important views that Europe needs to listen to. So please give a warm welcome to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Hungary, Peter Szijjártó. Peter, over to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation again. As a major participant of Hard Talks, Stephen, I can tell you that as a participant of international political discussions, you don't necessarily have to be short of clean socks to ask users of social media, don't judge me. So, but if you put the question how it comes that the foreign minister from Hungary comes here and gets the opportunity to talk to people at the Arctic frontiers, coming from a country which has a limited access to Arctic, let's put it this way, geographically and territorially being pretty far away, I can further exaggerate this question because this is my second time here, so I'm far away of our colleague from Singapore, and putting into consideration my participation on the Oulu Forum last year, I have now the opportunity to address you for the third time. And it clearly shows that the Arctic issue is not the issue of the Arctic countries. And whatever happens here in the Arctic has a direct and almost immediate impact on all other parts of the world and especially Europe. I would like to highlight here three aspects which have strong impacts on our national policies and have strong correlation with the Arctic issues. Number one, I'm coming from a country which has one of the largest assets of water on the globe when we put into consideration both potable and thermal water. And based on that, water management is definitely the industry which is one of the flagships of our national economy, having international references. And it is absolutely true that we are highly sensitive towards all global developments which increase sea levels, which create lack and shortage of water, which contribute to global warming, and which contribute deserts to grow. The second aspect is that we have been actively engaged in a discussion which Stephen just referred to about migration. Hungary is being located in the heart of Europe, so we're pretty much hit by the migration crisis, about which I guess you had some political discussion here in Norway as well. And although this discussion was not motivated by natural by causes or reasons caused by nature, but according to the forecasts, in the upcoming decades, because of the climate change, there will be massive migratory flows to go around the world, creating, of course, another humanitarian and security challenges in the meantime, and I guess tough political discussions. And the third aspect is economy. I'm coming from a small country with a very open economy, the performance of which is pretty much determined by foreign direct investments and export. So we are deeply involved in international competition where the temptation is very serious to sacrifice long-term interest for short-term. And I have to tell you that we have to perform here a balanced approach, and we have to make it clear that competitiveness and environmental protection must go hand in hand. None of them should overtake the other, because it will end up in unbalanced approach and will cause harms and damages. So what we can do in order to help the Arctic policy of the Norwegian government and the Arctic strategy of the European Union to save the Arctic, which is the asset of all of ours. 3 issues here I would like to highlight. Number 1, my country had coal with a very high share in our national energy mix. We got rid of that, and now we are making investments to further increase the share of nuclear energy, which is said to be one of the cleanest methodologies to generate energy. Now we are in the process to increase the share from 43 to 65% when it comes to electricity needs. Thus, we decrease emission. Number 2, the backbone of our national economy is the automotive industry. 29% of the industrial output comes from the automotive. And now we are putting a lot of efforts and financial resources in innovation and R&D regarding electromobility. So the biggest automotive engine plant of the world, which is located in Hungary and owned by Audi, is now starting to manufacture the electric engines of Audi. And we attach big and significant budgetary benefits and tax benefits to those who buy and use electric cars, thus to decrease emission. And the third and last thing which I would like to highlight here, how Arctic becomes part of global politics, is that this is a forum which shows very, very clearly that big issues, big global issues, can only be resolved through dialogue with the participation of all relevant stakeholders. So if we are not able to put together or convene the real big players of the world, including the United States, Russia, and all the others, we will not be able to overcome the significant challenges of the globe. So I really do hope that not only regarding the Arctic, but regarding the similar global challenges, this kind of political dialogue, including the biggest stakeholders, will take place. And if the Arctic issue is a frontrunner of that, then it makes sense to come back year by year and make the challenge sometimes to overtake the Singaporean minister regarding the numbers of Arctic you are invited. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. Now, of course, so we've heard from 3 members of government in different parts of the world, all committed to taking Arctic issues very seriously indeed, but all people in power. Now let's get different reflections from people who bring a slightly different perspective to our discussion this morning, based more upon science research and academic study. First up, let's give a warm welcome to the Professor of Practice in Science Diplomacy at the Fletcher School of Law in the United States, Paul Arthur Berkman. Over to you.
We live in a globally interconnected civilization. This fact is unambiguous since the 20th century when we had world wars. In terms of context, the oldest calendars on Earth are around 6,000 years old. It was the last century, 1 century out of 60 centuries, when we had global conflict. This perspective is based on insights that not only come from our civilization living, but civilization past. In this global context, the challenges as well as the solutions are international, they are interdisciplinary, and they are inclusive. These are holistic solutions to promote cooperation and prevent conflict. What I'd like to talk about today are two things. I'd like to talk about science diplomacy in the Arctic, and I'd like to talk about the Arctic Science Agreement, applications of science diplomacy and implementation of the Arctic Science Agreement. Science diplomacy is an international, interdisciplinary, and inclusive process. It's not a magic bullet. It's not a solution that will be forever. It's a process. It's a process that operates across time. This process involves evidence integration for the purposes of balancing national interests and common interests for the benefit of all on Earth. The process includes stakeholder perspectives, it includes holistic evidence and governance mechanisms. It involves options, options without advocacy that can be used or ignored explicitly. At the apex of science diplomacy is the concept of informed decisions. The best we can achieve at any moment in time is an informed decision. The process also starts with questions that are formulated by stakeholders of all stripes. Questions inform the types of methods to generate data. The data is answering the questions. However, data itself is not evidence. Evidence is integration of different types of data, natural sciences, social sciences, indigenous knowledge. That data itself becoming evidence in an integrated context only compels action. It doesn't define the types of actions that are required. The options inform the types of actions that are required. These options involve the types of decisions. The decisions are basically of two types: governance mechanisms and built infrastructure. In May of 2017, the Arctic Science Agreement, the Agreement on Enhancing International Arctic Scientific Cooperation, was signed in Fairbanks, Alaska. It occurred during a geopolitically challenging period between the United States and Russia. Yet the foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, and the Secretary of State, Tillerson, signed this agreement along with the foreign ministers of the other Arctic states, including the Faroe Islands and Greenland. This happened at a time of geopolitical strain. If we think about how to apply science, not in terms of post-fact and in terms of informed decision-making, the questions relating to the Arctic Science Agreement provide guidance. In effect, they are symbolic. They are representative for solutions that exist on a planetary scale. In the Arctic Science Agreement, there are three organizations that represent the scientific community. There's the International Association for Social Science, there's the International Arctic Science Committee, and the University of the Arctic, explicitly identified. Prior to the meeting in Moscow in 2017 in November at the International Science in the Russian Arctic, there was a paper published in Science, and this paper in Science suggested that there was a mechanism involving these three organizations to assist in providing a bridge between the scientific community and the diplomatic community to implement the Arctic Science Agreement. At the same time, we have a new mechanism arising. That is the Arctic Science Ministerial that will occur in October of this year. This will be the second Arctic Science Ministerial. And there is discussion about institutionalizing this Arctic Science Ministerial. If we think about what this Arctic Science Ministerial could accomplish, in effect, it provides a vehicle to bring together a bridge between the scientific community and the diplomatic community, complementing the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council is identified as a high-level forum. Arguably, the Arctic Science Ministerial is a holistic forum, a forum to bring together discussions not only from the Arctic community, but from the non-Arctic community, more broadly speaking, involving the Arctic Council, the Arctic Economic Council, the Arctic Offshore Regulators Forum, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. All of these activities coincide and change biannually with the Arctic chairmanships. In addition, we have an Arctic High Seas Agreement, and we have two other agreements on marine pollution and search and rescue. All of these will involve decisions. In effect, the types of decisions, the governance mechanisms themselves are insufficient. There will be built infrastructure that has to be required to implement these decisions? Where will these discussions occur? Where will the bridges between the scientific community and the diplomatic community occur? Arguably, the Arctic Science Ministerial is a mechanism to bridge this. All of these decisions, all of these solutions ultimately relate to sustainability. Sustainability at the core involves balance. It involves balance between economic prosperity, it involves balance between environmental protection and societal well-being. It also involves balance between the needs of the present and the needs of the future. It involves balance between promoting cooperation and preventing conflict. In this sense, we as a community of scientists and diplomats have responsibility not only for the Arctic, but in a global context to balance national interests and common interests for the benefit of all on Earth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Berkman. Let's move on to our next speaker, again bringing a sort of research perspective into this debate. So please give a warm welcome to the head of the German Arctic Office. Oh, forgive me. Sorry. I'll stick to the order I've got, if you don't mind, but don't worry, we're going to get to you very soon, Chandrika. But first, let's introduce the head of the German Arctic Office, Volker Rachold. Volker, to you.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation. That was my mistake, by the way, so okay. It's okay. So I want to elaborate a bit on what Paul said in science diplomacy. But before, I want to talk a bit about communicating Arctic science. And I think overall I see it in the Arctic a bit more positive than some of the earlier speakers, because I think the Arctic can be, in terms of communicating science to policymakers, can be seen as a model, actually. So when I talk to people on the street, everyone knows that the Arctic is warming, the ice is melting, the permafrost is thawing. For example, when I came here from Berlin with a taxi to the airport, the driver asked, "Where are you going?" I said, "Tromsø, to the Arctic." Oh, I'm worrying about the polar bears now that the ice is disappearing. So I think that message is pretty much heard in the Arctic. So I think we can really use it as a model for other regions. So that's my first part. And of course, the core message of everything is that the recipe to success is international science cooperation. I think that's what we learned in the Arctic. We learned this from the Arctic Council, International Arctic Science Committee, and I think the turning point in the Arctic in terms of making people aware of what's happening was ASEA, the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment in 2005, which was a joint venture of the Arctic Council and International Arctic Science Committee, and I think for the first time put together the scientific expertise from all countries doing Arctic research in an assessment and communicated the state of the Arctic to policymakers, to the public, to everyone. And I think that message was heard. And of course, we can congratulate the Arctic Council for running these kind of assessments. And that's only one, and there were others coming in the following years. And I think the way Arctic Council, with these assessments, communicates science to policymakers is really exemplary, I would say. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit is science diplomacy, building on what Paul already mentioned. And I think also here the Arctic is kind of a model, though my favorite example is, of course, from the Antarctic. I mean, in the Antarctic, we all know that based on science, it was the International Geophysical Year, 1957, 1958, the Antarctic Treaty was signed. And the Antarctic Treaty made the Antarctic a continent for science and peace, still today. So, of course, in the Arctic, things are a bit different, obviously, due to political settings in the Arctic, and cooperation could only start after the end of the Cold War, particularly after the famous speech that President Gorbachev gave in '87 in Murmansk. And that speech triggered all the developments we know in the Arctic. First was the formation of the International Arctic Science Committee in 1990, and then 6 years later, the Arctic Council in '96. So, and of course, the two organizations, one really on the science side, involving all countries doing science, and the Arctic Council focusing more on the members of the 8 Arctic countries, and of course on the people living in the Arctic, so the indigenous representation on the Arctic Council, they work together on producing these kind of assessments. So, and today, I mean, the Arctic Council, having the 8 member countries, having the observer countries, and having, of course, particularly indigenous peoples, I think they're really a model for regional cooperation, and they sit at the same table in the same room, taking decisions to protect the Arctic and to protect the livelihood of the people in the Arctic. And I think this is really crucial, and also to support sustainable development in the Arctic. So, and it's not surprising to me that the Arctic Council was just nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize last week, which I think is an indication of how wealthy that is. So, okay, coming back to science cooperation, so what's next? We heard about the Arctic Council agreement to enhance scientific cooperation. Yesterday afternoon we had a very interesting roundtable here in Tromsø discussing that. The other thing that was also already mentioned is the Arctic Science Ministerial. The first Arctic Science Ministerial Meeting was held in Washington, D.C., and organized and initiated by the White House under the Obama administration. And that was a success. And of course, right at the end of the meeting, the European Commission stepped forward and together with Germany and Finland offered to host the second one. And that will take place in Berlin, end of October this year. Of course, it keeps us very busy with organizing such a meeting. But as Paul already indicated, it's probably started a process. It's not the last one, I'm pretty sure. There are already countries expressing interest in the third one. And I think this is something really that we have to look forward to in terms of also cooperation and connecting science to policy, also through the agreement of the Arctic Council on enhancing science cooperation, because these two things obviously go hand in hand. So the themes we will be discussing in Berlin are things that were already mentioned here. Firstly, of course, we want to see the role of the Arctic in the global system. So what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So we see consequences of changes in the Arctic everywhere. The second theme, of course, is more towards the people living in the Arctic. So what is resilience? What is vulnerability of people living in the Arctic? And of course, there, the key priority is to have a meaningful involvement of the Arctic indigenous peoples in the Science Ministerial. And then the third theme is more addressing things like observations, data, and infrastructure, because we understand, and that's of course the beauty of having all the ministers of 30 countries sitting in one room and taking decisions and writing declarations, that of course you can really do something if they all agree on certain strategies for data management, observatories, and agree to join their infrastructure of Arctic research. So, and I think that's the core message. International scientific cooperation is the recipe to success for many things. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Volker. Now, Chandrika, forgive me for not getting you to speak just a little bit earlier, but do please warmly welcome now Chandrika Nath, who's the Acting Director of the UK Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. Chandrika, over to you.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. Delighted to be here. I'm so delighted I was trying to push my way on stage 5 minutes early. So great to be here. As you've heard, I'm Director of the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, and the role of my office is really to do a lot of what this session has talked about, to translate science for UK parliamentarians in layman's language, and really to bridge that gap between the academic community and parliamentarians in the UK. We do that in all sorts of ways. Sometimes it's just putting two people in touch with each other. Sometimes we write briefings in understandable language. We deal with all sorts of subjects of interest to Parliament. So just to give you an example, I've had to cover issues like, can we stop people aging? What's the best way to get chewing gum off the pavement? So it's very broad-ranging. So I'm a bit of a fraud. I have no specific expertise in the Arctic, and yet I have to provide briefings that relate to Arctic matters. So in that sense, I'm very pleased to be here today. My expertise really lies in how to bridge that gap between science and policy. And I think there are some general reflections which would be very useful to apply to the Arctic context, could generate some interesting debate. So I want to talk about just one specific line in the preamble to this session. Is the science community conscious enough about its responsibility to translate science to policymakers? Now, just to make a point that in the UK we're very lucky. We have an Arctic office run by the Natural Environment Research Council. We have an all-party parliamentary group for the polar regions, and that kind of body really helps move that conversation along. But in general terms, it's really important to ask the question, are policy systems designed to make effective use of evidence? It's not just about the responsibility all resting with the scientific community. The systems themselves have to work in such a way that they can incorporate evidence. And just to give you an illustration of that, in the UK, we have long-standing systems to provide scientific advice both to government and parliament, and there's a very clear separation to protect the democratic integrity of the process. But we did a long, hard look at how well research is getting into the UK Parliament last year. And we found that research evidence is really underrepresented relative to other forms of evidence, like information coming in from advocacy groups. And we found that our systems are actually biased towards just taking in expert opinion rather than considering scientific consensus. So even in a parliament where we think we do it well, there are issues. So the main point I wanted to make is that every national system is different. Advisory systems are different in different parliaments, governments at subnational level. And so some countries have no formal systems at all for science advice, and others are just developing them. So it is important to consider what are the implications of bringing all these players together with different perspectives, different levels of support at national level. What does this mean for national dialogue, for how international policy agendas work, and how can international processes help, balance out that disparity in levels of national understanding and perceptions of science? I've spoken very quickly, so I think I probably am. Yeah. So, okay, couple of other things.
Chandrika, you don't have to. I mean,
I've
Chandrika
got
and I can see this
no,
great
I'm
big
going to
clock.
keep talking. Couple of other points I wanted to make. Not all the science that's relevant to the Arctic is generated in the Arctic. So, for example, my office just did a briefing about the impact of alcoholism on children. So what does it mean if a child grows up in a family where the parents drink? Now, that's hugely important in the Arctic. There's a huge global body of literature on that. So what are the processes for getting all that science into Arctic governance frameworks? And I think that's an important question to ask. And then just finally to say, we talk a lot about post-truth. I don't really feel there was ever a pre-truth, to be honest. I never saw a seismic shift in attitudes to facts. I appreciate there have been in other quarters, but for me, there's been a long-standing debate between these different stakeholders, and I really feel that there are long-standing issues in how science gets into policy that sometimes these debates are a useful way of addressing, but in the UK Parliament, I feel there's a healthy attitude to getting research into debate. So, thank you very much.
No, thank you. That's terrific. Lots to think about there, and stuff that I hope we can then pick away at in our panel discussion in a short while. Our last keynote speaker before we get to discussion is from the director of the Institute for Humanities, Social and Political Sciences at the Northern Arctic Federal University in Russia. So please welcome Natalia Kukarenko. Natalia, over to you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be here today and to talk of the speed of changes that take place in the Arctic. I used to be director of the institute, and now I'm vice rector of the university, Northern Arctic Federal University in Arkhangelsk. But I would like to talk about the role of science and politics, how they can impact each other, and what is the role of the Arctic Scientific Agreement in that. When it comes to interaction of science and politics, of course, science is to produce evidence-based decision-making. And It is universities who produce facts that we know, that we are well aware of. It is universities who do research and education and show that the situation in the Arctic affects the rest of the world, it affects the weather, it affects infrastructure, it affects trade, industry, and diseases that we are at risk of. However, universities can also show that the life in the North, what it really involves, and what future humans can expect here in the North. In fact, we have quite a number of universities and academic institutions in the North. And as we know, they have made different associations because they realize that separate institutions are unable to produce the knowledge that covers the whole of the Arctic, that covers the whole of the issues that the Arctic is confronting. And we have the University of the Arctic, and it's interesting that over 40 of the organizations there, in total the University of the Arctic is about 170 institutions. Over 40 of them are Russian, coming from 25 cities and 15 regions of the Russian Federation. And that brings the second point that I want to stress. That is the back effect of politics on science. Because when we talk of the Arctic, it's not just a natural science approach, but it is also geopolitics we are talking of. And even if we have a look at the Arctic Scientific Agreement, you will see that each country who signed the agreement has a separate, special approach to how to define what is the Arctic area. And we have different approaches to how countries actually see themselves. For example, we know that Canada talks of itself as an Arctic nation. We know that Finland sees itself as the Arctic country. And Russia has discussed widely in the since 2000 onwards, which areas and regions and municipalities can be considered as Arctic. And so I see that here the universities can play also an important role to differentiate between actually geopolitics and ideology and science or evidence-based knowledge. And I think that universities, researchers, academic consortia can take this critical position to deconstruct the ideology approach and ideological constructions. And the last point that I want to make is that actually it is Peter Schult who said, he is the director of the Arctic Center in Umeå University, that researchers can present scientific facts and theoretical knowledge, know-how, but our politicians make decisions in the end. And I think that politicians can make decisions in the end only when they have the knowledge which is brought by academia and universities. And it is an important objective of the politicians to ensure a sustainable future. And I think only in cooperation between academia, business, politicians, industry, we can reach that. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Natalia. Natalia, do stay up here because we're going to now move to our discussion phase, and we want you to stay. And let me just call up, because we're going to do the discussion in two phases so that the panel isn't too big. But Ulla Elvestuen, Sam Tam, Peter Sciarto, and Professor Berkman, and Natalia, if you all join me up here, and then we're going to have a second phase of the debate in a short while. But if you five join me to start with. Seems to me, you know, this is actually an extremely important panel at this year's Arctic Frontiers because it touches, I think, upon a very current set of issues concerning how politicians make their decisions. And, you know, I'll be frank with you, in my mind, of course, is the Trump administration in Washington, but also other things. And I'll just kick off this by actually asking you three members of government to address this point. A British minister and I don't want to talk much about Brexit, it's nothing to do with today's debate, but a British minister during the Brexit campaign who was pro-Brexit came out with this extraordinary statement discussing the fact that most expert trained economists believe Brexit was a bad idea. He said, you know what? People have had enough of experts. It's a pretty extraordinary statement. Do you, in government, believe that if it's true that people have had enough of experts, that gives you a license to be less concerned with the expertise, with the science, with the research than before? Let's start, as we're in Norway, let's start with you, Minister Elvestuen.
I think it's quite a horrendous statement in many ways. And if you look at it, especially when we are here and with global warming, I mean, you've had a situation where the facts and the scientific agreement has been there since the mid-1980s at least. And since then, you've had managers of doubt that have created a situation where we have discussed global warming, if it exists or not, and it's been a political debate for 3 decades. And there's no doubt that this, if you just base the policies on the facts and on science, we should have had, we may not have had an agreement on what to do, but it should at least be an agreement to do something. And in many ways, just because a lot of forces have managed to create doubt about science, in many ways I think we have lost, in many ways, 3 decades of action when it comes to global warming. And it's...
And yet your own government could be accused, and is accused by some in your own country, of failing to be guided by the expertise on climate science when you continue to invest heavily in expansion of your fossil fuel-based industries. Exploration in oil and gas continues, and with ambitious future plans. You know, in a context where the experts are saying decarbonization is the only way to safeguard our planet, are you serious about being guided by the experts?
Oh, definitely. And I think if we have, as a country, need a strategy, how do we face decarbonization? Because decarbonization is coming and it has to come. What is our decision is that we are in the forefront when it comes to decarbonize what we can. I mean, our energy system is renewable. When you now go into transportation, I mean, I think Norway is doing more than many countries. I mean, 20% of our car sales are electric. We are pushing forward the hydrogen. Now we're moving into shipping. You have ferries that are electric. You're looking into hydrogen. No,
sure, but with respect, Norway's a small country, but you're still digging enormous amounts of new carbon out of the
And that is my
ground.
point. You have to look at you have to have a strategy, because there's no doubt that Norway are definitely dependent for the last 40 years on oil and gas. But we have to start to prepare. First, we are in the forefront of making a change within transportation and decarbonizing our economy. But we also are working on making our economy greener. We need a green shift in our country so that we can work with industry. We have to work with a separate or other parts of our industry so that we can prepare for a future where we know that oil and gas will become less important than it is today. And of course, we have discussions that have been strong political, that you have areas that we do not go into and explore, like outside Lofoten, Vesterålen, and Senja. Everyone that's Norwegian know that debate. We will, in our management plans that are to be set for 2020, we will set that line. Where does the ice shelf actually go? Where does the ice flow stop? So that we have set a line how far north we can go. And we also have something I think that is quite unique, that we now have a climate risk commission that is looking at what are the climate risks for the Norwegian economy. That is with what is coming for change with global warming, but also not what will we have to do as the world is decarbonizing, and how will that affect our economy. And when this commission was put forward its report in the end of this year, of course, then we have to make decisions how do we act also on that.
I made the point earlier, you're new to the job. I guess one question for you, both of interest to the Norwegians in our audience, but everybody else too, is the degree to which you are prepared to make a stand prepared to stand up to the trade and industry ministers in your government, the finance minister in your government, to actually defend the position which you made very clear in your speech, which is that we have to put climate change and climate science front and center of everything we do. So you are going to have to be strong to defend your interest and your perspective in a government where other people will bring a different perspective to the table.
And luckily, in the new government platform that was just settled last week, I mean, it is front and center how to deal with how do we lower our emissions. That is one of the first 2 points that is made there. And the other one, how do we change our economy so that we can prepare for a time where oil and gas has to become less important in Norway. It must be a smaller part, and I think everyone here is aware that it will be a small part of our economy, and we have to prepare for it and do it now.
All right. Well, Peter Sciatto, you represent a government which, we all know, in some circles in Europe is seen to be pursuing policies which are, nationalistic, which may be seen perhaps in a context which has something in common with developments in the United States, arguably some developments in the UK too. Going back to my original question, do you believe that your public in Hungary, and that generally in politics at the moment, there is a very genuine feeling that the public, and maybe their politicians too, have had enough of experts?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, you cannot have enough of experts because I'm pretty much in line with the quote we just heard at the very end of your speech, saying that in order to make a decision as a politician at the very end, at the first stage, you need experts. What I do think is that hypocrisy and political correctness are things which we had enough. And we had some opportunities already to debate or to speak or talk about that hard in your program. But what I can tell you is that when it comes to climate change, for example, and when we speak about hypocrisy or political correctness, I think we really need to perform a balanced approach between competitiveness and environmental protection. Because as you just had the question to my colleague, so why are you still digging for oil and gas? Because they have to, because we still use oil and gas. So it will not change from one day to another.
But until now, that's a recipe for really not acting in ways that the science might say are urgent. If the science comes to you and says, you know what, it's too late for sort of bridge building and endless discussion and more meetings and more Arctic Science Council sessions, you need to act.
Yeah, but I agree with that, but acting still takes time. For example, put our case. I'm coming from a country where we were coal-based, as I told you. Then we started nuclear. Regarding the renewables, we cannot apply hydropower because we don't really have mountains with mountain rivers. We cannot really apply wind because we are in a basin. So the only thing what we could take advantage of is solar, which we are trying to do, but we have just started to build new reactors for our nuclear power plant, with which we can increase the share of nuclear regarding the electricity supply from 43 to 65%. But it takes 12 years, to build those reactors. Or when it comes to electric cars, we understand electromobility is very important. Just put into consideration, for example, the engine factory of Audi in Hungary. They produce currently 2 million engines, diesel. Now they are starting to, annually, now they are starting to produce a couple hundreds of thousands of electric, but still they have more than 1 million of diesel. So in order to make the change, in order to make the shift, you need time. And you cannot forget about the competitiveness issue, because at the end of the day, your voters will ask you how it comes that our country is losing position in the global ranking. So you cannot demand a country like us, for example, to get rid of manufacturing diesel engines. You cannot demand Norway to get rid of digging for oil and gas.
I know none of this is easy, and you guys as politicians have to be accountable to your electorates, and frankly, you need to go back to your people and persuade them to vote for you again in the next election. So none of this is simple.
Within less than 3 months, by the way.
Good luck with that, yeah. But the thing is, that competitiveness, that pragmatism, that realism argument that you are wheeling out, Peter, is precisely the argument that Donald Trump uses to say that there is no way the United States is going to adhere to the Paris Climate Accord principles. At some point, you have to call out politicians
but Steve,
who wrap themselves in the message of, oh, well, I'm looking after my people's economic interest, I'm looking after my country's competitiveness, if that is doing fundamental damage to the science, and the scientists are saying, you know what, it's too late for that kind of argument, you either listen to them or you don't. But let's be honest, if you're not prepared to listen to them, just say it.
Right, but just three very short things, because I want the others to have the floor as well. Number one, that to be pragmatic and realistic doesn't mean that you are against science and you are against experts. I think scientists and experts have their responsibility as well to be realistic and pragmatic. Number two, I don't really like this kind of dogmatic feeling of stigmatization, to be very honest. I myself, coming from an EU member state, I represent my country in the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union. And as you refer to that, we are speaking, well, most of the time out of the mainstream of the European Union in important issues. Until November 2016, I was immediately stigmatized as a Putinist. Now, from November 2016, I have a liberty to choose whether I'm stigmatized as a Putinist or a Trumpist. So, you know, but this kind of approach, I think, doesn't help, because I understand that President Trump has a difficult relationship to media, difficult relationship to some groups, but at the end of the day,
he has a difficult relationship to facts and the truth.
But he was elected as the President of the United States, and we have to deal with it. We have to deal with the US, which is led by Donald Trump, and we cannot get rid of this fact. So we regret it a lot, or at least that could have been better when he made the decision to rule out from the Paris Agreement, but we have to deal with it, and we have to cooperate with the US in a way to re-engage them as much as possible.
All right, well, before I get to Sam with another governmental perspective, I want to bring in you guys. So start with you, Professor Berkman. What do you make of the conversation we're developing here? Because, you know, you stood up there and you talked about the dialogue and the importance of having the mechanisms for scientific evidence and interpretation to be fed into the political debate. So what are you feeling from the words of the politicians?
So I think we have to take a step back. Science is bandied around in this discussion without definition. I would define science as a study of change, which would include the natural sciences, it would include social sciences, and it would include indigenous knowledge. And I would argue that every decision that every government has ever made and every government will ever make is always based on understanding patterns and trends. And those patterns and trends come from the natural sciences, from the social sciences, or other sources of information. So in a sense, this discussion about post-fact, and we're operating at Twitter timescales. And Twitter timescales, it's impossible, I would argue, to come up with realistic understanding of what the facts are. So that's part of, I would say, the finesse that our president has created in confusing this discussion. In terms of...
sorry to interrupt, but in the context of your president, and for just to pluck out one example, his determination, as he puts it, to be the best president ever for the coal industry in the United States of America, you know, when you and the scientific community hear that sort of thing, isn't it incumbent upon you not just to present a sort of counter argument, but to call that out, to say, this is what is going to happen if the United States invests big in coal for the next 50 years?
So calling it out, that's interesting. I would say calling it out is that the discussions at a political timescale are unrealistic to solve the problems of the world. The problems that operate over sustainability timescales operate across generations. And just to put things in perspective, for those of you that are young in this audience that will have children, your children will be alive in the 22nd century. The responsibility of our generation is to think across the 21st century. The urgencies that exist don't only exist at political timescales, they exist across generations. And so in that context, I think the discussion really involves pushing the dialogue from security or political timescales, looking at risks of political, economic, or cultural instability, to thinking about solutions across generations. And the next generation will be alive in the 22nd century.
But politicians do not have that mindset, do they? They don't think generationally, they think about the next political electoral cycle.
Well, this is the point. This is exactly the point. And if you talk to the politicians and listen to the representatives here, they're speaking largely from national perspectives.
Interesting, that actually is a good point to bring Sam in. You know, some would argue that Asian politics is a little bit different. I'm not suggesting that Singapore isn't a democracy, but it's a particular kind of democracy. And we've had this debate before, and I've had it with your Prime Minister as well. So you know, there is a degree of management in your society which does not necessarily exist in our European stroke Western notions of what democracy is. So therefore, does it make it easier to actually think in generational timeframes rather than just electoral cycle timeframes? And therefore, does it make it easier for the politicians to actually take seriously the scientific evidence, the research, and develop policies more truly based upon it?
Well, thank you. Thank you for giving me the time to answer your questions. We actually are the same, but then we are also different. You are Caucasian, I'm Chinese. So although we are all human beings, and therefore in every different civilization, in every different cultures, you have a different way of working systems to deal with the local context. Now, in the Singapore's context, I want to attempt to answer your first question. That is, whether are there too many experts? Well, in the case of UK, you are a big country. You have a big population. And Singapore, we are a very small country. We only have 5 million people. We have a different situation. That is, we actually don't have enough experts. So how I wish that we can be like in your situation where you have too many experts. Because the success of Singapore actually depends on listening to people and also listening to scientists. And our approach for nation building has always been using science, using objective analysis, facts and data to construct our policies. And our policies actually has been the one that has been driving Singapore from a third world country into a first world country in 30 years. So we are pretty proud of that record. And that record is achieved because we actually rely a lot on scientific research and all that. And that's the reason why when we take an interest in the Arctic affairs, then the first port of call is actually to come to the Arctic Circle. And this is the reason why year after year, we come back to attend the Arctic Frontiers Conference and other forums and all that, just to make sure that we have the opportunity to meet with experts, to listen to them. And as a result, then we are able to craft out our Arctic policies. So just like I remember when I first came to Tromsø, when I went to visit this city called Karasuk, which is the semi-parliament, and in January, and the weather was -40. For someone coming from a tropical country where the daily temperature is 33, 34 degrees Celsius above zero, 33, 34, to go to a place where it is -40 is quite a change.
Well, thank God for your seal skin.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So I was soundly advised by the expert there that in Arctic, there is no bad weather, only bad clothing.
Yes. No.
So I would like to extrapolate to that. In the opinion world, there's no bad advice, only suitable advice. So Singapore's modality for development has always been that we listen to the experts, and then we decide on which experts' advice to be accepted. And once we are convinced, and then we will do it according to the plan. And coming back to politics, you don't have time.
Well,
Okay,
we're a bit short of time, and that answer was very interesting, and I want to bring Natalia in, and then I quickly want to get a couple of audience questions. But Natalia, did I hear it right when you were talking about the relationship between the scientists and the policymakers, did I hear you right when you talked about the bad effects of politics on science? Do you think that in your case, in Russia, that politics and science have sometimes a damaging relation, or there is not a positive relationship between the two?
I wouldn't say that, but I would rather say that it is the case. There are situations when politicians refuse to listen to science, and I think climate change studies and climate change research is the case when actually international cooperation between researchers in Russia and abroad within networks like EUArctic allowed to bring that to the political level. For example, I mean, until international cooperation, no one discussed security as an issue apart from the military context. And thanks to the international cooperation of academic institutions, we started to think of human security as well. And this is the issues that came to the political agenda from international academic cooperation. And still, when I mentioned that politicians can use the knowledge that is produced by science in different ways, right? And I think it is the role of academia to be critical and to say when it is actually, when it is no longer discussion of scientific issues, but becomes a political issue. Like, I mean, if we talk of the Arctic, it was Lassi Heinonen, a Finnish professor, who said, actually, what is the Arctic? It's just a piece of ice. It's no land, nothing. And we are discussing frozen water, and we have geopolitical discussions, and I mean, how comes? So I think it is the role of science to say that, stop.
Okay, yes, good. All right, well, I dare say we've got quite a lot of scientists and researchers and others in the room, along with policymakers. So hands up, but we've got time for a couple of questions, and I'm going to just change the panel a little bit, but let's just get a couple of questions at this point. So ma'am, you've got your hand up. Can we get a microphone down here to the front area, if we get the microphone right now? So if you wouldn't mind, just stand up and tell us your name and a very brief question, because we are short of time.
Hello, my name is Tanzi. I have a question for the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Hungary. I study at the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the Central European University in Hungary, in Budapest. And I have a question, actually 2 points to make, really quick points.
Well, quick as you can.
Yes, the first point is that Minister Orban wants to shut down the Environmental Ministry of Hungary. Second point is that my university is threatened to be closed down. And a lot of science is coming from my university, and I really wonder how you would see this balance of competitiveness and environmental protection when you actually deny the scientific voice to speak truth to power in the first place.
All right, well, that's a powerful question. Let's see what the answer is.
And two of them, immediately. You know, we have a very small government. So in 2010, we won the election. We realized that the country was in a terrible economic shape, and we understood that politics had to make some cuts as well on its own. So we cut into half the number of the seats in parliament, from 386 to 199. We cut into half the number of the seats in the local councils, and we basically cut into half the number of the ministers. So we are maybe the only European country that doesn't have a Ministry of Finance. So Minister of Economy is responsible for finance as well. It's a small budgetary department in his ministry. So we don't have a separate ministry for environmental protection either, because we only have 12 ministries. So
that's obviously a signal, isn't it, of priorities? I mean,
what?
The fact that one of the ministries you closed down was the Ministry of Environmental Protection.
No, we didn't close down because we merged ministries together. So we have Ministry of Agriculture, which is partly responsible for environmental protection issues, and we have Ministry of National Development, which is partly responsible for issues regarding environmental protection. But my ministry is, for example, Ministry of External Economic Relations and Foreign Affairs. So even Ministry of Foreign Affairs had to be merged with another one. And I like this big portfolio, by the way, because then it makes sense to get an economic focus for foreign policy. The other question is regarding the universities. We have passed a new legislation in the Hungarian parliament, which ensures level playing fields for all universities. So all internationally based universities have to comply with the same kind of regulations, meaning that there are 6 universities coming from outside of the European Union, 3 of them from the United States. And the operation of these universities must be based on an intergovernmental agreement, number one. And they can only issue diplomas of other countries if they have educational programs, training programs in that other given country. So from 6 of these universities, 3 have already complied. One of them was an American, by the way. I myself signed the agreement, so I really do hope that your university will comply with these regulations as well, just like the other universities did.
But, you know, the fact is you stand to lose a lot of high-quality scientists as a result of this.
About what?
If this university, which this lady is currently attending, is closed down.
But why should it be closed down? There are same regulations for all universities in the country. And if all other universities can comply, I don't think that a very good university couldn't comply. So you can be sure that there will be no problem. There's level playing fields ensured, and all the universities have to comply with absolutely the same kind of regulations.
I think a Hungarian minister saying you can be sure there'll be no problem may not convince all Hungarians right now, but anyway, let's not get too stuck on the internal politics of Hungary, except Natalia.
I like level playing fields on the stage as well, you know, not being a biased in either side, yeah, but we got used to it.
Just a short comment. This is exactly how politics can affect academia. I mean, by establishing universities, by setting regulations, by providing financing, you know, so this is actually like when the Arctic became geopolitical interest, a lot of states developed strategies for development of Arctic zones, and then they established also Arctic centers, Arctic universities, and they provided financing for some of them. So this is how they set agenda, actually, for the researchers as well.
Yes. Well, you certainly can't keep politics and academia separate, that's for sure. I mean,
making laws is, I think, the duty of politics. So, and if you make laws, you put impacts on different groups of society. That's
all right, okay. Let's have one more quick one, because then we've got to just do a quick shift of panel. But you, sir, just stop there. Yep, that gentleman there. Yep, off you go.
My name is Oleg Bodrov from non-governmental organization from Russia. My question to Minister from Hungary.
You come from far away. You know?
It is a little bit strange for me, like expert on energy issue, that you decided to develop the nuclear energy like solution from the climate changes. But it's very well known that we have not only nuclear electricity production, but we have a very long technological chain. So, as I know that nuclear energy, it is not a solution from the climate changes, because if you will provide the analysis all technological changes like chain, like nuclear fresh fuel production, decommissioning of the nuclear power plant, spent fuel roads, management, it will be not solution. May I ask you, what is the analysis you use for such kind of
and Peter, be brief, because obviously...
Yeah, of course. You know, I don't say, I think I haven't said that nuclear is a zero-emission form of generating energy, but if you compare our former situation regarding having an energy mix based on coal to the current one, which is now more and more based on nuclear, and if you pose the question which one is cleaner, which one has a lower level of emission, then definitely the current one is the one which is more friendly to the environment. But I wouldn't say it's 100%, of course, but it's much better than it used to be before.
Well, that is a hugely complex argument, which involves a lot of science and indeed politics too. So let's leave that right now. If I may, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to change panel a little bit. Just our plan is to hear as many voices as possible. So if I may, as politely as I can, thank Professor Berkman and Natalia Kukarenko very much indeed. Thank you both. If you return to your seats, and I'd like to invite Volker Rakold and Chandrika Nath to join us, just to fill in the two chairs. And as you are new to us, you two, I'd like your take on what you're hearing. Chandrika, I was very struck by your description of you know, what you do in the UK Parliament, which is try to synthesize the latest scientific research and make it accessible to politicians so that they can truly understand it and be aware of what is going on. I mean, in this debate, I cited a UK minister who'd said, you know what, we've had enough of experts. You seem to be saying that's not representative of the UK generally right now. That would you say that what you see as politicians who are respectful of and eager to understand and take account of the latest science?
So I can only talk in a personal capacity. So from my perspective, yes, that is my observation. And just to illustrate, my office just completed a study of how effectively the UK Parliament is using academic research. And that was really endorsed by Parliament. That members of Parliament were really engaged in the study. We did 100-odd interviews with members of Parliament and staff, questioning them about attitudes to research, and they were really interested in the results. So I don't think...
Because you're at that sort of bridge, and a lot of the speakers today have spoken about a bridge and the constant dialogue necessary between science, evidence, fact, and political decision-making, because you're sort of on that bridge yourself, talk to me about what you see as the responsibilities of the scientists in terms of the way they communicate, how they communicate, the degree of noise they make, and how they pitch their messages. What do you see as the successes and failures of science right now?
So I think that one of the things that scientists can tend to do is just see policymakers as just one big block. And it's actually, there are lots of different sorts of policymakers. So we often find scientists don't understand, even within the parliamentary system, that they might be talking to opposition, government, backbenchers, shadow ministers, and they all have different uses for science, different motivations, different interpretations, and sometimes you get a policy brief which is just a blanket approach. It's just a brief for policymakers or a workshop, and I think the nuances of the system can be lost. But I wouldn't say that's a science.
You think it's incumbent upon scientists to become better informed about the political process?
I think it's incumbent on both sides. I think the systems need to be less opaque, and I think that scientists need to understand that sometimes just holding a workshop isn't enough, and you need to think about who exactly is coming and what are they doing with the information. It's a lot to do with the incentives for engaging with policy. I think there need to be really strong incentives for scientists to engage with policy, and not just because they're doing it from an altruistic motive. It has to be built into the system, and in the UK, we do have recognition for scientists to do that.
Yeah, Volker, I used a potentially inflammatory phrase a little earlier. I think I might have been talking to Peter, I can't remember, but I said, isn't it time the scientists called out the politicians? Do you think that's a stupid, crude way of looking at it? I mean, is it ever the role of science and scientists to call out the politicians and to make a real stand on a point and say, you know what, that's unacceptable, that's wrong. If you choose to do it, understand that you are completely running counter to consensual scientific opinion.
No, I mean, I do work on this interface. So if you take Germany, we currently have 7 ministries that have interest in the Arctic. And of course, we are sitting between the science and the politics. And they come to us, and they have questions, and they need advice. I'm sitting on the scientific side, so I'm a part of a scientific institute, which kind of offers this office as kind of a service to politics. And I believe it's more a dialogue than just scientists communicating. I mean, first of all, of course, you need to package the information from science in a way that's understandable, which is challenging partly. But then, of course, the other thing is also that you get questions from the politics that you have to bring back to the scientific community. Because at the end of the day, scientists are all paid by taxpayers' money, and they also provide some kind of service to society. That's how I would see it. So this dialogue between the two is really important. Of course, it can be somehow frustrating if you communicate your message and politicians, they listen to it and they understand it, but still there are other factors that really prevent them from implementing things or changing things. For example, take Germany and take our emission goals. They are not realistic. It doesn't work. Yeah? Or take the Paris Agreement. We already now know, almost clear, for sure, that it's impossible to reach that goal. Yeah? We are already beyond that. It's too late. And of course, and it doesn't really matter if, let's say, politicians do not want to hear you, or they do hear you, but there are other things that prevent them from changing things. So it can be somehow a bit...
But how worried are you? This is like the mechanics of of this interface. How worried are you about being seen as a science voice, being seen as party political, as taking sides? Is that something you never ever want to put yourself in the position of being perceived as?
I don't think this is a question of taking any side or taking.
But
any
it can
position.
be. I mean, for example, let's hypothetically. I mean, obviously you're German, you're not American. But if you were in Washington D.C. at a time when Donald Trump and his administration were, on the brink of making an announcement that they were withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, and the Democrats on the other side were saying that is the biggest, most fundamental mistake, not just for the United States, but for the world, and we would oppose it, and we reject it, and we think the president is making an historic mistake. In the end, you have to take a side, don't you? I know you're supposed to be an objective scientist, but you have to. I'm just trying to understand your mindset, whether you would come out, be very vocal and noisy, and make a stand, and therefore line up with one side against the other, or whether you would feel that absolutely was not your job.
In Germany, it's a bit different, so we don't have that issue. No, but I see what you mean. No, of course, I mean, the scientific community, and that was also clearly said, people agree that things are changing, and people agree that it's humans that make the changes. I think there's no doubt about that. And of course, that's the message that you can communicate, and you have to continue communicating to the politics. And of course, there are certain parties, also within Germany, we have these parties who do not want to hear that and who do not want to listen to that. Of course, as a scientist, if it comes to the next election, they wouldn't get my cross.
Yes,
of course,
but I guess what I'm getting at is whether you feel that the power of science and scientists is devalued if you step beyond a certain mark in terms of your public voice.
See what you mean? No, I think as a scientist you have to be a serious communicator. Yeah, so I think it's what we talked about, providing the expertise, and of course the expertise has to be really sound, and that's important. And I think in the Arctic, that's what was my message: the international cooperation and the expertise taken from a broad community, not only one country, but international community. I think that's at the end what counts, and these were the successful things that were communicated, like IPCC. I mean, IPCC is now very well recognized. The Arctic Council assessments, very good example of how science is communicated. Single experts are always, how to say, doubtful, I would say.
Yeah, okay. Well, it is a fascinating area, and I don't know whether people would like to put in their own questions, which may well be much more interesting than mine, so feel free. Great, we've got some hands up, so we'll get the microphones working again. We haven't been over this side, so we'll come over to you, sir, and then we'll come to you over here. But yeah, thank you, sir. Stand up and we'll get the microphone to you. And if you would, just keep it brief and just give us your name, first of all, and then your question. So here's the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Brendan Kelly. I'm from the United States, and my question is for Chandrika Nath. I found it really interesting that you said that the science is less well represented in informing the Parliament than advocacy groups. I think the same is true of the U.S. Congress. My question is, do you have ideas on how science could do a better job of informing those bodies without losing the value of its independence from advocacy?
I think one of the important things for science to do is to make it really clear how their knowledge is generated and what the value of that is. So I have a slightly different definition of science here to Professor Berkman. So I would say science is information that is generated in a rigorous, systematic way and can be replicated, and that's incredibly valuable, and I think that doesn't always come across. So if you're putting the voice of a scientist against an advocacy group, it's important that the rigorous nature of the scientific questioning is clarified.
But so are we both, a scientist cannot be an advocate, is that what we're saying?
I think, yeah, I think that's a sensitive area, and I would say that the real way to do that is to make it clear what is the value of your information and what is its strengths relative to other forms of evidence, because I don't actually think the advocacy group's information is less valuable. All information has value, and each group has to make it clear how it was generated and put it in the wider context.
Okay, does that answer your question? Yeah. Good, thank you, excellent. We'll come over here now. Here is the microphone, sir. Stand up, and if you would, just give us your name and your question.
Hello, my name is Klaus Dodds. I work for the University of London. So just two observations. One is about the capacity of academics to act in the way that we've talked about. And I think you need to talk about the politics of the academy. Who gets to do the speaking back, the hard talk, if I may use that term? As Mary Beard often points out, power often goes hand in hand with men, so we need to think about how that power works through things like race and gender and not assume it's uniform. And the second thing is, we're talking about post-truth and fake news and disinformation. Where does that leave indigenous and non-indigenous northern communities who have been dealing with fake news and disinformation and frankly not being listened to for centuries? So I worry a little bit about what are the implications. Just at a time when those voices are being heard, we're now worrying about post-truth and fake news. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I don't know who would like to take that on, but Ulla, why don't you start?
It's not really just a question. I think we all can worry about that. And of course, with the indigenous people, of course, we have to be aware of, with the climate change that we're seeing and the speed of the change, especially in the north. And the speed is astounding, because this will affect the people here and indigenous communities way more than most people realize. So it's, I don't have another answer that this is something that we all have to be concerned.
But I think the question was partly about how systems work right now, and in terms of who has, in a sense, literally, who has the microphone, who has the voice, whose voices are heard and whose voices are not heard. And the questioner was pointing out, frankly, most of our panels are male-oriented. I'm a man. Chandrika, you're not a man, and you're one out of, we were 6, and you're the only woman on the stage right now, and Natalia was the only other woman on the stage when she was on. Well, so there are issues here which are about, the way, this isn't necessarily just about science or the Arctic, but it is about whose voices get heard in public debate and who carries the power and the influence.
Yeah, and you have to look at the system. And like here in Norway, you have the Sami parliament, you have the consultation system that we have. Like when we have issues in my department that concerns the Sami population, we always have to have the consultations there. So it has to be a systematic approach to it. And of course, I mean, I'm a what can I say, white male, 50
You're putting your hand on your heart.
I cannot change that. But of course, all parties and everyone has a responsibility that the people they put in front has to be a diverse group. That is also part of it.
Sam, I'd like to get your perspective on some of this.
Well, in our systems, actually, we don't look at the sexes and then to pick a winner. We have a system where we base on meritocracy. It's not about who has got the loudest voice or who has got the microphone. It's who has got the most reasonable and rational voice. And when that person has got the most rational, objective, and then factual voice, we will give that person a microphone so that that person can continue to say what he or she wanted to say. And then as a policy makers, then we'll listen carefully, and then we decide. And then in Singapore...
who's judging who's got the most rational voice?
Well, for the lack of a comparison, obviously the person who needs to make a policy decision has to make a decision on who to listen to. So in this case, so if you run an organization, then the board of management will have to decide. But if you run a country, then the government will have to decide.
Ultimately,
right?
yeah.
So ultimately, yes.
Yeah.
So
okay.
the question, the challenge is that how do you actually discern who has got the right voice? And sometimes we don't know everything. In fact, our challenge is we don't know many things that we do not know. So the only way to find out the truth and the facts is actually to listen to more people. And this is why it is very useful for us, so for so many like-minded people with brilliant minds in different disciplines to come together on a common platform to share ideas. I think the more that we do this kind of sharing, I think the better will be the discovery of new facts and all that. Then I think that will also, in a sense, reduce the possibility of fake news.
Right. Well put. We've got time for a couple more questions. There's one over there, so let's get the microphone over that side. Stand up, sir, if you would, and we'll get the microphone to you. The microphone is on an epic journey across the floor, so just bear with us. There we are.
Hello, my name is Bas Wetzelaar from Actiam, a Dutch asset manager. My question is about science-based targets and companies. We, as an asset manager, trying to dialogue with companies to have them science-based targets, second degrees. For state-owned companies, what's about the discussions going on in Hungary, Singapore, and Norway about science-based targets?
Yeah, good question. Science-based targets, how do they feature in your decision-making?
Well, actually, through our president, we have been deeply engaged with the United Nations to put together the sustainable development goals and the Agenda 2030, which we stick to very strictly. And you know, we have the obligations within the European Union as well to cut the level of emission. What our position is that we have to comply with those at the deadline. So we don't really like the approach which says that the interim report should put forward obligatory, let's say, goals. So according to our understanding, the interim reports are rather for information, sharing information and seeing where we are compared to where we want to get by 2020 or by 2030. So the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 and the European obligations are being taken very seriously into consideration in Hungary, and the flagships of these procedures are definitely the state-owned companies, which definitely have to comply with these requirements.
Interesting phrase, being taken very seriously, but I mean, to what extent are you prepared to make these sorts of science-driven targets binding, you know, to actually say, this is a commitment, this is a binding commitment, and if we fail to meet it, judge us, we will have failed?
Well, if you don't take either the Sustainable Development Goals or the obligations of the European Union, if you don't take them as obligatory, then you're going to be punished, then you're going to be, you know, out. So you definitely have to take them as obligations.
Okay. I don't know if the other two of you who sit in governments want to just address this question of
sustainable development goals are definitely part of what the government says is our major goals, and it has to affect all parts of our policies. When it comes to reducing our emissions, we are trying to get an agreement with the EU, so reduce it by 40% by 2030. That is there. And of course, other tools, I mean, we have the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. It has been decided by Parliament that they are to divest from coal. So we have different aspects that are there all the time.
Yeah, all right. Sam, I think we'll have to make this the last comment, because we are actually a bit late, so we all need a cup of coffee. So Sam, just give us a final thought.
Okay. So in our philosophy of running the government, we always believe in yin and yang, to strike a balance. So we look at the science-based data objectively. We also have to interpret it from the social angle and political angle. If we think that we are able to make adjustment to make sure that the majority of the science-based data are able to be incorporated into our policy to bring about greater benefits for the people, for the society, and also for the nation, we would do it. So I just want to go back to one point that you made yesterday, that you said that in the Arctics, you can have the cake and eat it. So my counter argument is that you can have the cake and eat it, but you eat some, you keep some. Use the science to bake some more, so that continually you can actually have a lot of cake to eat it. Right. Don't eat it at once.
Don't be greedy. Yeah, leave some. Okay. It's a good way to end our discussion, because I don't know if there's cake outside, but if there is, take Sam's advice and don't eat it all, just leave a little bit. Have a cup of coffee. But before you go, and don't forget, we've got to be back. I mean, we're running about 5 to 10 minutes late, so have a 15-minute break, and then we'll be summoned back. Have a cup of coffee. But before you go, please give a very warm thank you to our panel. Thank you very much.